I was 12 years old, I had a chance to go to Peru, which is where my dad grew up. And I remember sitting there as I was just kind of taking everything in. And the more I learned about Peru, the more I loved it, the more I loved the people, the place, everything. And then I saw this shirt, and I was trying to figure out what it was. And my dad started explaining to me it's in this place called Nazca, and they're known as the Nazca lines. And as I learned more about it, I realized how much more mystery there was behind it and everything, but it was so cool. And then I started researching it and looking at it, and as I was reminded of this yesterday when talking to my dad, the Nazca lines look one way when you're standing next to it, but in order to get a really good picture, you have to be high up in the air. Now these Nazca lines from the ground look like just any set of lines, or someone like dug rocks out and stuff like that. But it's not till you get up in the air and look from above that you can see the full pictures. You can see this hummingbird, or you can see this spider, and there's a monkey, and there's several other drawings, but you can only tell what they are from high up in the air. That's why when they were first discovered, they didn't really know what they had discovered in the 1920s. It wasn't until the 1930s when commercial pilots began to fly over that they realized there were these huge pictures. And the reason I'm saying that is this. A few weeks ago, Chris was able to start our series in Proverbs chapter 3, looking at verses 5 and 6 specifically and what those two verses meant. But what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go above. We're gonna kind of take an aerial view of the chapter and see how it looks as a whole. So as we look at this together today, we are going to talk a little about verses 5 and 6, but then we're going to see how it fits into the overall chapter and what it is that Solomon's trying to share with his son. Because remember, at the beginning of this, he pleads, he says, son, remember these sayings, tie them around your neck, write them down in your heart. This is what he was trying to get across, and how all of this is connected together. So like I said, verses 5 and 6 says this: trust in the Lord with all of your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, or acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Now, this is a huge statement. It's only a few words, but it's really saying something huge. Trust in the Lord. Don't depend on your own understanding. Seek him in all of your ways. There's no area of our lives that is left out of that. There is not a single square centimeter of our being and our day-to-day life that is left out of these two verses. When it says trust with the Lord with all of your heart, it means everything. Now, first we have to trust him to become our Savior. We have to trust in him, put our trust in him, put our faith in him, that Jesus Christ came, died, rose again because he was the Son of God, and he was making the way to get to God the Father. But this is the starting point for the rest of this chapter. And after we've accepted Christ our Savior, then the trusting doesn't stop. It's a daily thing. It's something that we have to submit our hearts to every morning when we wake up. Every morning when we start our day, we have to decide who we're going to trust. Are we going to trust in ourselves and our own wisdom, the way we think things should go, or put our trust completely in God? As we look down a few verses later, in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9, it says, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Now maybe you're sitting there going, oh, here we go. It's talking about money now. They just want all our money and everything else. No, I want us to see how this is part of how all this stuff fits together. When it talks about honor the Lord with your wealth, the first fruits of all your crops, are we going to trust God with our finances? Are we going to trust God to supply our needs? Are we going to trust God by giving to him first? Giving him the first fruits. Now when it says first fruits here, it's talking about how they used to bring in the crops. The first fruits were always the best that they would bring to the temple and lay down as an offering. They didn't sit there and do everything else they needed to and say, okay, these are the scraps. Now I'll give that to the temple. I'll give this to the Lord. No. He said, bring the first fruits. So what does that mean for us? That means when we've worked our job and we receive our paycheck and stuff like that, what we do is we give God his first. We put him first. trusting that He will supply our needs completely. We don't pay everything else off and then all of a sudden get to the end and be like, oh, well, this is all I got left. So we scrape it off the table and say, all right, Lord, here you go. Because we're not trusting the Lord with all of our heart in that point. I remember a story that my grandfather used to tell. And he and my grandmother had made a decision that they were going to tithe starting 10% from what they had. Now, he had never done this in all of his life, but when they got married, he said, no, this is something that we decided to do together. When they were in Bible college, it got to the point where they literally had nothing. My dad was a baby. He needed milk. They didn't have milk. They didn't have crackers. They didn't have anything. And he started and he just walked over and he grabbed his keys. My grandmother asked, what are you doing? He said, I'm going to the store. She's like, you don't have any money. He said, but we need these things. Russell needs milk. He had put his trust completely in the Lord. He didn't know how this was going to happen. He didn't know what was going to happen. He wasn't asking God to bless him with mountains of money so that he could just kind of roll around in it. But he knew that God had promised to supply his needs. So he jumps in the car and he starts driving towards the store. And all of a sudden, wham, somebody hits him in the back. Now, if you know anything about the cars during this time, it took more than a little bump to cause real damage. And the guy gets out, he checks on my grandfather, everything's there. He's like, listen here, just let me give you $20. Now remember, $20 back in the 50s was a little bit different than now. So it's worth a lot more. He goes like, here, this is for the damage. He was in a hurry, so he gave him the $20, he took off. My grandfather had $20 to then go buy the groceries he needed to. God will supply all of your needs if we put our trust in him. Then as we go down a few verses later, he talks about Proverbs 3:11 and 12. He says, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline and do not resent his rebuke, because the Lord disciplines those he loves. As a father, the son he delights in. Now, this is one of those things like when we were talking about fear of the Lord, people hear the word fear and they're like, how can that be a good thing? They hear the word discipline, they're like, no, I don't want discipline and stuff like that. But what it's talking about here is instruction. Other parts of the Bible, this same word is translated instruction. And so what it's saying is, do not despise the Lord's instruction. God's sometimes going to have to teach us lessons, and sometimes that means it's going to be in situations that we won't really enjoy. We won't relish, and we're not going to sit there and be like, man, I really hope I can go through a hard situation so that I can learn more. But that seems to be when we learn the best. It's in those kind of situations that we learn to put our trust completely in God the Father. I remember when I used to coach football back in the U.S. I coached a girls team for a while, then I coached our guys team for our school. And one thing all the players knew was when it was my turn to do conditioning, they did not like it. We would go out and we would train and train and train before we ever touched the football. We would be running, we would be doing sprints, we would be doing all these different kind of things. I remember the day when I took my girls team and we had a 3-story building. And I said, all right, girls, what we're going to do today is we're going to run stairs. And they looked at me with this face like, are you kidding me? I said, we're going to run all the way up, we're going to run all the way down. We're going to take a break, and we're going to run all the way up and all the way down. We did this for 2 hours. Now, when it was happening, they hated it. I will say the guys whinged a lot more than the girls ever did. But that doesn't surprise me, to be honest with you. And they were like, but why are we doing this so much? And I said, you'll see. And as we got into our season, it was very obvious, very quick, that the fitness of my team was better than that of anybody else in our district. And in the last 15, 20 minutes, when the other team was spent, my girls or my guys, they were flying, they were running, they were still feeling good. They still had their legs. Now, they hated it during the time, but the benefits showed later. When we're going through times of instruction, it isn't always going to be pleasant. But by going through these times, we learn more about who God is. We learn more about his character and how we can completely trust and obey him. So first it talks about trusting, then it talks about, honoring the Lord with our first fruits. Then it talks about do not despise the Lord's instruction. This learning in times of instruction is so important because it prepares our hearts for the wisdom that he wants to give. Now, a lot of times the word wisdom is thrown around in our time, and people think knowledge and wisdom is the same thing. I've met very knowledgeable people who were not wise at all. All you had to do was look at their decision making in their personal lives, and you could tell they had a lot of book knowledge, but when it came to applying it, they didn't have a clue. Let's not confuse the two. Being book smart does not mean you're wise. Wisdom can only come from one place. True wisdom can only come from God the Father. It can only be found in the Word of God. And that is what Solomon is trying to tell his son here. He's trying to say, hey, look, to gain this wisdom, you have to turn it all over to God. And when you do this, then we'll see it in how you handle the first fruits. We'll see it in how you handle the time of instruction. And then what happens is when you do that and when you've submitted your heart completely to him, what we're going to have is we're going to have wisdom. And here's what it says in verses 13 to 26. I know it's a long few verses, but it gives such a beautiful description of what wisdom is. It says, blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding. For she is more profitable than silver and yields better returns than gold. She is more precious than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with her. Long life is in her right hand, in her left hand are riches and honor. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her. Those who hold her fast will be blessed. By wisdom the Lord laid the earth's foundations. By understanding he set the heavens in place. By his knowledge the watery depths were divided, and the clouds let drop the dew. My son, do not let wisdom and understanding out of your sight. Preserve sound judgment and discretion. They will be life for you, an ornament to grace your neck. Then you will go on your way in safety, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Have no fear of sudden disaster or of the ruin that overtakes the wicked, for the Lord will be at your side and will keep your foot from being snared. Now think about this. Think about how he describes wisdom here. He's talking about it's like more valuable than silver and gold and rubies. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, you watch these films and all of a sudden they're trying to find treasure. And as a kid, you're like, man, I want to find treasure. That would be so cool. You're going through these caves and all this stuff. I used to watch this film called Goonies when I was a kid. I loved that film because it was a bunch of kids my age trying to find treasure. And they do find it and they're amazed by it and all these things happen and at the end, they need to have some of this treasure, and everything else had been taken away except this one little bag that one of the guys had his marbles in. And he had dumped out the marbles and he had filled it with rubies and emeralds and different things like that and diamonds. So when they pour it on their hand, everybody's like, oh, this can save it. And Solomon here is saying, guess what? Wisdom is more valuable than any treasure you could imagine. When we trust in the Lord and honor the Lord and submit to the Lord's instructions, we are given this wisdom that is described so beautifully here. It is more valuable than any treasure we can imagine. And we can have rest because we know in whose hands we are resting. When we're given this wisdom, we know who's in control. We know who has us firmly in his grasp. And that is why it said, then you will go on your way in safety and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet because we're resting in God the Father and the wisdom that he gives us. You say, okay, that's great. I want wisdom. I can trust in the Lord completely. I really want all these things that you're saying. And so what if we are given these things? It says, okay, now what? Now what do we do with it? Do we hold on to it? Do we sit there like Gollum in his cave and just holding the precious one ring and just trying to hide it from everybody? No. What we do is we pass it on. We have received, now we need to release. We need to release it in a way that is described in Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, where it says, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. When people see you living a life that is completely trusting in the Lord, and they're seeing how, whether it's the good times or the bad times, regardless of the circumstances, how your hope does not change. Kind of like what we saw in the book of Philippians when we were studying, how Paul, even though he was in prison, still had joy and hope because he knew who his hope was in. He knew in whose hands he was resting in. So this is what it says at the end of chapter 3. It says, "Do not withhold good from those from whom it is due, when it is in your power to act. Do not say to your neighbor, 'Come back tomorrow and I'll give it to you,' when you already have it with you. Do not plot harm against your neighbor who lives trustfully near you. Do not accuse anyone for no reason when they have done you no harm. Do not envy the violent or choose any of their ways, for the Lord detests the perverse, but takes the upright into confidence. The Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous. He mocks proud mockers, but shows favor to the humble and oppressed. The wise inherit honor, but fools only get shame." Now at the beginning of this chapter, we see Solomon point his son to what we see Jesus say in Matthew 22. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He talks about loving the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And if you look, we see Solomon speak of loving God completely like that. Because he says, trust in the Lord, completely trust in the Lord in everything that you do. So if we're saying everything and all, that includes your heart, your soul, and your mind. Trusting in the Lord completely, with all that we are, with all that we have. We cannot love God completely unless we have put our trust in him first. Then at the close of this chapter, as we just read, we see referenced what it says that Jesus says is the second great commandment. Love your neighbor as yourself. It shows us how we should and shouldn't act towards our neighbors. You say, well, who's our neighbor? Is it the people who agree with us next door? No, it's anyone that's around us. Well, what if they don't believe in what you believe in? Love your neighbor as yourself. Well, what if they have different political views than I do? Love your neighbor as yourself. What if they don't act nice to me? Love your neighbor as yourself. When we have wisdom, we can look at them and see them as God sees them, as a person who was created in his image, that his son died for. That is one of the gifts that we see with wisdom. That is one of the things that we see as we trust in him completely and we've submitted our heart completely and he gives us this wisdom. Then we are able to act wisely and be a light to those that are around us, regardless of how they act or react to circumstances or our thoughts and ideas or whatever. There's no one that we will pass on our day that Jesus did not die for. His love was complete. He wanted everybody to come to the knowledge of his son. Now, to do these things, we must look and put into practice what Solomon shares with his son. Once again, looking at it from above. We must trust in the Lord completely, regardless of what our own thoughts and desires might be. What if I sit there and think, well, I know a better way to do this, Lord? Is my path going to be straight like it talked about when it says trust in the Lord with all your heart and not leaning on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him and he will make your path straight? No, what I'm going to do is if I try to do it my way, because I know better than God on this one, all of a sudden that straight path that was going to lead to the perfect destination, all of a sudden I'm going to start curving and running into other issues. Now, does that mean that when he says it's going to be a straight path, that it's going to be an easy path? No, we've talked about that before. Like what it says, don't despise his instruction. The second thing it says is, give of our first fruits. Are we going to trust God completely with everything? Are we going to trust God with what he's given us? Are we going to trust God to handle our finances and provide all that we need? This world has been convinced that if we have more, we'll be happier. then why do so many millionaires and billionaires get divorced and seem miserable sometimes? They can buy anything they want in the world, and yet they're not content. Paul talks about this when he says, I've learned how to have a lot, and I've learned how to have a little because I'm content in what God has given me. It's a great place to be if we can be content in Him. Let's not despise the instruction that God gives. As we're going through these times when we see circumstances, say, all right, Lord, not why, but what for? What is it you want me to learn through this? Then we're able to gain the wisdom that comes from the Lord, which allows us to rest in Him. All these things are working together. When we look at the chapter as a whole, we can see how these things all fit. And when we have rested in Him and we have that wisdom, then we are to release it to those that are around us. To love our neighbors as ourselves. To let our light shine. Because that's what we've been given in Christ. We've been given this light and we're supposed to shine it and point it straight to God the Father so they can see the difference in us. So now that we see all these things and we look at the chapter as a whole, there's really only one question that we now have. What will we choose to do? Will we choose to trust Him completely in every area? We're going to try to hold certain areas back and then hope He blesses the part that we let go? Or are we going to sit there and say, Lord, have it all. Have it all. I rest in You. Help me to be a light that shines for You.